And so, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining this from. I'm delighted to host the Sharjah Education Talks, Sharjah Edu Talks, as they call them, where we'll be looking at the future of work and education within the UAE and the world. Today, I'm delighted to have with me Grant Lickman, who is a profound educator, administrator, and someone who's been working in the transformation of schools all across the United States for many years now. And I'd love for him to introduce all the interesting work he's been doing and how he's seen it from his perspective over several decades of experience in the schooling system. And then we'll get on to the most exciting part, which is the future. So thank you, Grant, for joining us, and we're delighted to have you with us.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thanks so much for having me as part of your talk series. Yes, so I was in the for-profit business world for the first part of my career. My academic training is actually not in education. I was a marine geologist, plate tectonics expert, researching deep seas. I got involved in the international oil and gas business, but at a certain point in my life, I decided to take another turn and realize that education really has been a passion of when you're in a period of evolution, and others will say it is more risky to not make a change. And frankly, I believe that from what I see from where I sit and where I visit, the schools that take the latter view are and will be the true leaders of the future.
Thank you, Grant. And I think that's a really good segue into my next question, which is, if we don't know what the future is, what, I guess, are we solving for in terms of the characteristics and traits of a good is a pejorative term, I guess a normative term, a effective individual, professional, whatever, in the world right now for someone who's in their 20s?
That's a great question, and I wasn't planning on getting into this because it's a little bit wonky, but I will to start off at the 50,000-foot level. I actually wrote a short article last fall, and I'm sure we can find it, and you can put it in your video notes or your meeting notes, where I asked that very question. If we're trying to solve for a future that is less certain, is more volatile, more ambiguous and complex, what's on the other side of that equation? If I'm trying to solve for VUCA world, what's on the other side of that equation? And after a lot of introspection and some modest research, I came up with the other, balancing the equation with two terms. One term was meaning, and the other term was purpose. And in the definitions of meaning really fall what education has been focusing on for the last century and a half. Because meaning is about allowing an individual to place himself within the context of the world in which they live. It's the placing myself within the sum of human knowledge and history, and how did we get here from our antecedents, our historic antecedents across all sorts of disciplines. And schooling, education has done a very good job of that up to this point. And we have to congratulate all those who've come before us on being very, very good on that term of preparing students to go forward. But then there's this other term, which is purpose, and that is helping young people find, I hate to use the same word, but the meaning for themselves going forward. What is their role? What is their impact going to be going forward? And there are very authoritative studies that have demonstrated, I think the word you were looking for, rather than necessarily a great employee or good employee, has to do something around success, happiness, satisfaction, fulfillment, those sorts of things. And there's some very authoritative studies that have demonstrated that people who have a sense of their own purpose are physically, emotionally, socially healthier. They're more successful in the jobs they pursue. They have more friends and broader networks and those sorts of things. And yet the vast majority of young people coming out of grade 12 and going into college do not have a sense of their own purpose. And so this, I think, at the 50,000 foot level is where education needs to be looking in order to solve for that equation, which essentially says we don't know exactly what we need to prepare our kids for. That's going to be a moving target. So we have to give them the tools to succeed where the moving target is involved. And I'll take a breath here and let you intercede if you'd like, but then I'll come down to a little bit more of a concrete level, because that's sort of the most abstract I can get.
And I think it's really powerful, and I see it all the time with young people, and they struggle to keep up with it for pretty much until their 30s or whatever, and then eventually we have a midlife crisis in their 40s after they realize they've wasted most of their lives chasing someone else's dream. And I guess the question that relates besides purpose is that, well, okay, you have purpose, but surely you need certain tangible, or what you call identifiable and recognizable skill sets that cut across and attributes, perhaps mindsets as well, that are critical. Yeah. And I guess that's the one we're really failing our youth in, right?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say we're failing. I think we are evolving to learn to redesign a system, and that's a complex problem. And the schools that I get to work with are schools that recognize that that the traditional method of education is not meeting the design challenge of the future. So what are some of those skills? You know that, of course, and all your listeners will know that in the latter part of the last century and the early part of this century, people started saying, here are the, here are the 21st century skills and that sort of thing. For some reason, all those skills had to start with C. It was very annoying to me. But here, I'll identify three that I think we now that we're more than a fifth of the way through the 21st century. Here's some that I think are exceedingly important, whether in the UAE or anywhere else. The first one has to do with managing information. We are challenged like no other time in human history with an onslaught of multiple streams of information, multiple simultaneous streams of information. And so having the ability to manage multiple inputs, separating fact from fiction and opinion from fact is a skill that is, we don't know necessarily how to teach very well yet. Here in the United States, the inability to separate fact from fiction and opinion from fact is threatening the very underpinnings of our democracy and of what many have called, the great American experiment and the last great hope in the world in some ways. We simply must train our young people on how to do that when they're being bombarded from 360 degrees with all sorts of different information, some of which is claiming to be factual and of course is not. And then the third element of that, I would say, is to be able to synthesize and prioritize information. Again, because there's so much, our computers are not necessarily good at synthesizing and prioritizing. It's a very human skill, and that's a part of information management that I think is absolutely critical now and will be so in the future. So that's sort of one group of skills. The second group of skills, I think, is around designing and creating. When I grew up in school, if you use the word create, you were pretty much talking about being in the art studio, maybe in the potter's, throwing something on the potter's wheel. We know now that frankly, the underpinnings, the very foundation of the modern world economy is rooted in the skills of design and creation. I think it's hard to argue that in the last part of the last century and the first part of this century, the most vibrant center of gravity in the world was Silicon Valley. And to some extent, it's still a pretty big center of gravity, whereas places like Dubai and Shanghai are starting to take that on as well. And these are places that the foundation of the success of Silicon Valley was designing and creating and innovating. And so there are skills that we know we can teach students, and we are teaching students in that at some of the great schools that I get to visit and work with. And then the third element is really working with a team. Throughout my schooling and throughout traditional education.
Given the shifts that we're seeing, technology-led shifts and transformations that we're seeing all over the world, in the most remote places in the world, are going to be particularly relevant in the next 10 years, unlike the last 40 years, where we kind of were just what you call consumers of it. And as you mentioned, really rightly so, Silicon Valley, with their great production houses in China and elsewhere, were producing all of these great innovations, including Web 2.0 and the like. But they were really, the rest of the world was just consumers, right? And we just consumed most of it. And the manufacturing house of China produced it, and Silicon Valley designed it. But what's the future, and how does that future look in terms of how do more people become creators? And
Sure.
Does that mean that there is another set of skills that will be required that are more specific and pertinent?
Well, I think there are a lot of questions embedded in what you just asked. The simple answer is we know we can teach creativity and design and innovation. We know that it's proven. There are many schools around our country and around the world that are doing that very, very well. And those kids are starting at the age of kindergarten or first grade or second grade. And I've walked in and I've talked to those students. And I've talked to students who at first grade can explain what a Shark Tank is and how product development works and what a profit and loss is and how you organize a team and how you recruit team members. And that's at first grade. So these are kids that are already learning that language at a very young age. Then they become learners where the responsibility for the learning is on their shoulders. It's not the responsibility of a teacher to push material at them and force them to become consumers. It's the responsibility of the teacher to create the conditions that allow these students to continue to grow as learners. Those sort of overarching skill sets that I described should be in the same category as things like literacy and numeracy. You have to be able to read and add and understand basic science. And have a basic concept of history in order to be a productive citizen. Well, in today's age, you also have to be able to do the things that I was describing. So I think that's one answer to your question. A second answer to your question is that when you talk about the next 10 years or the next 15 or 20 years, we have to recognize that the vast majority of students, certainly in this country, and I believe it's true around the world, are not getting yet the kind of education that highlights what I just described. They're still stuck in the old system. And so for those students, moving on to the next 10 years is a disservice because they aren't even getting the leg up. They aren't even getting the contextualization yet of things like design and creation and team building and those sorts of things. So having said that, yes, I do think that when we look ahead the next decade or so, first of all, let's admit that we don't know what the next decade is going to look like. One area that I think many others have talked about is that the rise of artificial intelligence is going to have a profound impact on education. Artificial intelligence essentially started in a very gross, overly simplified sense when we all could sort of log on the internet and ask Google a question, or Yahoo, or whoever it was, on a search engine. And that made a whole lot of book learning irrelevant because I didn't need to know that answer in my head. I could Google it or search for it in the internet. And now, of course, that's evolved very quickly. In the relatively near future, many of the things that we're training our students to do are going to be able to be accomplished vastly better by a computer. And we're sort of stuck in this difficult spot right now. So many of the jobs today and in the future are going to be STEM jobs, and I would argue that we should be teaching every kid from kindergarten up. We should be teaching them coding. That should be just like learning a foreign language, learning universal languages. But at a certain point in the future, coding is one of the things that computers are going to be able to do a heck of a lot better than people. And so, what are the skills that humans will always be able to do better than computers? Hopefully, always better. There are things like empathy, creativity, compassion, intuition, some of that synthesis and prioritization. These are the things that humans hopefully will always do better, and they are not part of the mainstream of education today, just like computer technology was not part of mainstream education 20 or 25 years ago. So I think these are some of the things that we really need to be paying attention to, alongside some of those more defined skills that I was talking about. We call them human-centered skills. And these are not soft skills by any means. Some people refer to them as the soft skills. There's nothing soft about them whatsoever. And frankly, if you interview enough people in the business world today, you'll find out that the people that are rising most quickly, the people most valued, are not the people who can do the nuts and bolts of the jobs. They're the people who have these sort of human-centered skills.
That is absolutely profound, and I'm sure I've learned a lot. So just as a side note, I'm going to be leading a school soon. So this is really very valuable material for the DNA for that school, just so you know. And I will implement it and probably invite you there. But I did want to ask you another question. I guess, given that you mentioned, and it's somewhat related to what you said, which is, well, these are the kind of building blocks, and I love the idea that these should be the building blocks of education now. With literacy and numeracy, there should be an emphasis that, how are you guys doing in all of those specific areas like managing information, designing, and creating. I guess the question is how, and I'd ask it in multiple levels, is you obviously have a lot of depth and experience in the United States and a little bit in Dubai and the UAE. How do you feel are private schools in the UAE and in the United States preparing students to enter the workforce or business? How do you think they're doing? I'd love to hear both contexts. I know you mentioned the United States, but I'd love to hear United States and the UAE.
Yeah, so it's a loaded question, and one of the reasons it's loaded is that the students pretty much around the world that are privileged to go to private schools start off with distinct advantages that prepare them to succeed. I don't want to say regardless of their education, but they are much more well buffered against a poor education than students who are not privileged to go to those schools. So to say that students are successful in their careers because they either went to this type of school or that type of school is not good science. There are some other enormous variables there, and in the United States, the main variable is poverty. Students of color and students who are impoverished, regardless of what school they go to, are disadvantaged. So we have to make sure we understand that. I think that there is. We have to ask the question: how are we defining success? If the definition of success is how are our schools doing at getting students accepted to a certain range of colleges and universities around the world, then private schools, I know in the United States, and I imagine in Dubai, in the UAE, probably do a pretty darn good job at that. But I think we have to ask the question, is that actually the goal? And for some families, that is the goal. I would argue that there is an increasing recognition that in order to be competitive 20 years from now, those skills that I enumerated, which our schools are not teaching, are actually the skills that are going to be more important. If you have a child who's 5 or 10 years old today, and I've asked this question to many, many parents. Here in the United States, the main goal of those parents is not to get their kids into Stanford or Harvard. They would love it if it happened, but they come up with a whole lot of other different words that define success for them. And so we have to change the design parameters to meet the expectations in the future. If the only defined outcome of success that anybody uses is get my kid into Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, or Stanford, well, okay, that's where, there's a bunch of schools that are great at doing that. My belief is that given what those universities and many, many, many other colleges and universities have valued in the past is not what they're going to be valuing in the future. We're seeing that transformation happen. And again, you can be on the leading edge of that, you can be on the following edge of that, and that's up to schools to decide. That's the nature of periods of evolution.
That's awesome, and that's exactly what I thought I'd want to hear. I guess, what do you think? Having that given that you're working with schools, particularly in the U.S., how do you think they're moving along their journey of transformation, and how are they doing? You mentioned, some of the schools are doing really well in terms of actually they've come a long way.
There's an extraordinary histogram that we could paint. When I published my last book, oops, wrong hand, Thrive here, I put an appendix in. I just listed all of the schools and districts, and most of them are in the US, some in Canada, some overseas, that I had somehow come across my radar screen over the last 8 or 10 years. And some I visited, some I've never visited, that sort of thing. But all of the schools that I cited in there are significantly changing what I call the school operating system in some way. And we can get into that in just a minute. What is the school operating system? Because that's really where we get to the nut of how this happens. And again, I will say that, 10 or 15 years ago, that page in my appendix wouldn't have filled a page. Now I found that when I went back and looked at these 3 books that I published in the last 8 years, and I'm just one person, there were hundreds of schools and individuals and networks that are focused on what you and I would consider significant transformation. Now that leaves thousands and thousands and tens of thousands not on the list. So there are schools that are moving in this direction, and I think if I may, let me just outline for you what I think some of those sort of core directions really are. There's a tremendous amount of commonality and overlap when schools get into this discussion of what do our students need in order to find their meaning and purpose, in order to succeed in this more volatile and uncertain world that they're going to inherit. How do we achieve that? So here are some things. First of all, it is a vastly less teacher-centric and subject-centric learning environment. It is a learning experience that is much more student-centric. We understand that students are individuals. They don't all learn at the exact same time in the exact same way based on their biological age. And putting a bunch of kids into a classroom with one teacher for 50 minutes to learn a bit of a subject and then taking a quiz or an exam on that and move along is antithetical to what we know about how great learning takes place. So that's a part of it. The learning is much more experiential. It's much more hands-on. And much less focused on consuming and regurgitating content, which really is the foundation of standardized sort of tests. So we're going to see less reliance on standardized exams and college entrance exams. We see a shift in the assessment practices, shifting away from assessment based on an old worn out set of quizzes and exams, or time in seat, and then progressing students based on, the fact that you sat in your seat for this year and took a certain number of tests, to really focusing on mastery. Students demonstrating that they've mastered the content, the material that they need to move to the next level. Obviously, a lot of this is rooted in more project-based work, interdisciplinary work, transdisciplinary classes, curriculum that look at and use much broader themes as coalescing elements of the learning. And so those are some of the big, I think, elements that we see in all these schools that are moving rapidly on this trajectory. There's one other that was starting to evolve very robustly. And then about 2 years ago, with the start of the pandemic, gasoline was dumped on the fire, which is, we have known certainly in the developed world, that the levels of stress and anxiety amongst young people in very unhealthy ways has gone off the charts in the last decade or so. And I think because of the pandemic, finally we're seeing the schools that I visit, and certainly the private schools that I visit, the independent schools, universally are adopting something along the mantra of, we can't learn if we're not well. Student and adult wellness has taken on a very high priority, and I think it is rapidly becoming an element of the education system that we paid lip service to up before the pandemic, and now we've realized if our students and our faculty are not well, both physically, emotionally, and socially, good learning doesn't take place.
Thank you, Grant, and that's really, I guess, really powerful distillation of what I would want to implement in the school, and I think it's quite a bit of a journey, right, for students and teachers, and to come through this process and try to do this. Well, thank you so much, Grant. It's been a delight and pleasure learning so much from you. You are a treasure trove of transformation learnings and knowledge, and I really hope that people can benefit from it. I, for one, will certainly take you up with it, and so rest assured, I'll reach out to you because this is exactly the journey that I think every school should be taking, regardless of where they are and what position they're in. And so thank you so much for that. And with that, I'd like to conclude and thank all our listeners and viewers to be able to learn from Grant. Grant, thank you for taking so much of your time. And I hope you take on his offer to contribute to your school, because I think it's a once in a century offer. And really, this is an opportunity to transform the future of so many children and youth out there. So thank you, Grant.
Thank you for your time, for having me, and for all the great work that you're doing.